What is the total amount of Bitcoin that Michael Saylor owns, either privately or indirectly through his MicroStrategy corporation? And what instruments did he use to raise billions of dollars of liquidity to execute his buys? This is what we're going to look at in this video. Enter Michael Saylor. Michael Saylor is the CEO and co-founder of MicroStrategy, an analytics and software company that he co-founded in 1989. After 30 years in business, Michael Saylor still holds 72% of voting power. He's the chairman of the board, and that means that his power in the boardroom is unquestioned, and his word pretty much is MicroStrategy law. Before starting to aggressively buy Bitcoin, MicroStrategy was definitely considered a healthy company, but it was also a company that was considered beyond its high growth years. They were selling a very mature software product with healthy margins to big corporate clients, and kind of quarter after quarter, the business was gushing out cash for their shareholders. How much cash exactly are we talking? By the second quarter of 2020, roughly 60% of MicroStrategy's balance sheet, a little more than $500 million, was made up of cash and highly liquid short-term investments. So when the outbreak of the pandemic happened and kicked off a tsunami of money printing by governments all around the world, all of MicroStrategy's reserves, $500 million, saved up over 3 decades of business success. Basically, Michael Saylor's entire life's work were sitting in cash. And Michael Saylor himself has famously described that seeing all that value sitting in cash felt like watching a melting ice cube. Let's have a quick listen.
About Bitcoin.
I think by the end of the second quarter, what I realized is we had a low growth, cash rich company. We're going to generate $75 million a year in cash flow for the next decade. We weren't going to grow 20, 30, 40% a year. We were going to have a stable, mature business that made a lot of money. And we had a block of $500 million of cash on our balance sheet. And I realized that no one cared, and we were viewed as being utter failures. So we realized that we had a good business and had a lot of cash, but the investors valued the cash at zero.
Yeah. And
they valued zero growth at zero. And then we started asking the question, why is it that the world values excellence as zero unless it's hyper growing or parabolically growing? And why does the world value $500 million at zero? And that got me thinking. And what I realized is cost of capital had gone from 8% to 20%. And they were discounting the cash. And the assumption was $500 million of cash is going to be worth nothing in a decade. That kind of scared me. And the next thought was, if you can't grow your company 20% a year, it's worth nothing. Yeah. Well, okay, so why is it worth nothing? And the answer is because the currency is collapsing. And so once you understand that, then you realize you've been put in this quandary by fiscal policy, which is if you have a company and you can't grow at 20% a year, you're going to fail. And then you realize that if you're an employee, if you're working for a living and you're not raising your salary 20% a year, you can't keep up. And then you understand why. The why is because we're discounting the cash flows at the risk-free rate of 20%. And at a discount rate of 20% or more, nothing works. That causes you to realize that the only strategy for survival is to become asset rich. You can't succeed in business. And by the way, you can't succeed in life if you don't actually create an asset portfolio of high quality assets that will appreciate in value faster than the rate at which the currency weakens. Yeah. That's the epiphany.
So with that understanding, Michael Saylor came to the realization that Bitcoin was the best asset that he could hold in order to preserve the wealth created over a 30-year career. And because he owns the majority of the voting rights and controls the board of his company, he was able to act fast. Phase 1. Bitcoin as treasury reserve asset. The first Bitcoin investment by MicroStrategy came in August of 2020 when they went ahead and swapped $250 million from their reserves for 21,454 Bitcoin. Then on September 11th, only 1 month after their first Bitcoin buy, MicroStrategy filed an 8K form with the SEC which is just really a fancy way of saying that Michael Saylor was managing expectations in the stock market. Because in that 8K report, MicroStrategy not only announced that the board had now formally and officially adopted Bitcoin as the primary treasury reserve asset, but that the company's holdings of Bitcoin may increase beyond the $250 million investment that the company disclosed on August 11, 2020. And then, 3 days later, on the 14th of September, MicroStrategy announced that they had bought another 16,796 Bitcoin using a further $175 million from their dollar cash reserves for the purchase, raising their Bitcoin holdings to a total of 38,250 Bitcoin at this point. Now, obviously, these kind of moves attract some attention. And over the next 2 months, Michael Saylor starts to raise his public profile. He goes on a lot of interviews, he goes on a lot of podcasts, he starts tweeting, and then on December 5th, MicroStrategy announces another 2,574 Bitcoin purchased with $50 million from their cash reserves. So let's pause for a moment and take stock up to here. Within a period of less than 4 months, MicroStrategy had taken $475 million of what was once roughly $540 million in US dollar cash reserves and bought Bitcoin with it. And at this point, the company was holding 40,824 Bitcoin in total on its balance sheet. And by the way, just in case you're wondering, Michael Saylor had also been buying Bitcoin privately, because on the 28th of October, he announced on Twitter that I personally hodl 17,732 Bitcoin, which I bought at $9,882 each on average. Alright, can it get any more bullish than exchanging all of your personal and corporate cash reserves into Bitcoin? It can, because as we're about to find out, Michael Saylor was just getting started. If phase 1 of his Bitcoin accumulation strategy was exchanging his personal savings and corporate reserves for Bitcoin, then phase 2 could be titled Leveraging Up. 2 days after MicroStrategy had finalized the conversion of almost 90% of its cash into Bitcoin, they dropped the following bombshell. December 7, 2020. MicroStrategy announces proposed private offering of $400 million of convertible senior notes, due 2025 in a private offering to qualified institutional buyers. MicroStrategy intends to invest the net proceeds from the sale of the notes in Bitcoin in accordance with its treasury reserve policy. Let's translate that. MicroStrategy, up to that day a software and analytics company with a very healthy balance sheet, steady cash flows, and minimal debt, announces that they want to raise $400 million of debt in the financial markets in order to buy more Bitcoin. Now, you may wonder, why would somebody lend out $400 million to MicroStrategy just for them to turn around and buy Bitcoin with it? Wouldn't it make more sense to directly buy Bitcoin or some kind of Bitcoin derivative? Well, you got to remember that at that time still, most, in fact almost all financial institutions, for reasons of governance or because of some regulatory constraints, could not buy Bitcoin directly. They couldn't buy it directly, they couldn't buy some kind of Bitcoin derivative or financial instrument. So if you consider that as the context, then one of the very few legitimate ways for most fund managers to get their hands on some kind of, or any kind of Bitcoin exposure really, was to buy those debt notes from MicroStrategy, which on paper was simply a NASDAQ-listed software company that was issuing some corporate bonds. So not surprisingly, there was huge demand for this debt offering. It was hopelessly oversubscribed. And only 4 days later, Michael Saylor tweeted that MicroStrategy had raised not $400 million as per their original announcement, but in fact $650 million. So they got $250 million more than what they originally asked for by offering a 5-year convertible note at 0.75% annual interest. For those of you who don't like doing math, that's roughly a cost of $5 million per year for 5 years for the privilege of buying $500 million of Bitcoin. So on the 21st of December, Michael Saylor tweeted that MicroStrategy had added another whopping 29,646 Bitcoin to its Bitcoin holdings, which had just been bought with those $650 million of borrowed money. Meaning that at the end of 2020, Just as Bitcoin was about to cross the $30,000 price mark for the first time, MicroStrategy was already holding more than 70,000 Bitcoin on their balance sheet. Phase 3, on the Bitcoin standard. And with that, we welcome the new year 2021. The Bitcoin price crosses into the 30,000s, and now begins what I would like to call the real Bitcoin buys of MicroStrategy. You see, one could make the case that the huge Bitcoin acquisitions of MicroStrategy in 2020, each one of them at a volume of anything between $50 million all the way up to $650 million, in large parts using borrowed money, a lot of press, a lot of announcements, Michael Saylor going on a lot of CNBC interviews and podcasts. One might make the case that these huge trades were in some way kind of speculative, short-term plays to pump the Bitcoin price or to pump MicroStrategy stock or to pump both of them. And some in the finance media were definitely starting to push that as the narrative. However, on January 22nd, Michael Saylor tweeted that MicroStrategy had bought another measly $10 million worth of Bitcoin. Like what? Just $10 million after buying more than $1 billion in the previous months? What was going on? Well, MicroStrategy was basically sweeping the excess cash the company had earned over the past few months of doing their good old software business into Bitcoin. And these small, regular buys continued. Another 10 million on February 2nd, another 15 million on March 1st, and it keeps going. 10 million here, 15 million there. All in all, 8 such purchases of Bitcoin by MicroStrategy this year so far. And even though these small regular buys are dwarfed by the more than $1 billion worth of Bitcoin that MicroStrategy bought the previous year, I think that these small buys really showed, like, they were strong signal. They really showed the long-term strong conviction of Michael Saylor, much more than the big buys that they had announced in the previous months. Now, of course, in these 6 previous months, the price of Bitcoin had gone up by a lot, and MicroStrategy was well in the green with those investments, which means that in theory and in practice, their balance sheet would support even more debt to be borrowed out against it, which is exactly what they did. So on February 16th, Michael Saylor tweets out that MicroStrategy is considering offering another round of convertible notes, this time to raise at least $600 million. And well, we all know what comes next. Supply and demand, anyone? This debt offering, again, is totally oversubscribed. And within the next few days, MicroStrategy raises over $1.05 billion of corporate debt. And the interest to be paid on those more than $1 billion? 0. I might have to repeat that. The annual interest to be paid on more than $1 billion of debt by MicroStrategy, in order to buy Bitcoin with it, is 0. All right, the Bitcoin price at this point was sitting a little above 50,000 US dollars. What does $1 billion get you at that price? Another 19,452 Bitcoin added to the MicroStrategy stack. Clearly, this second debt offering was an even bigger success than the first one, and both rounds were completely oversubscribed by more than half of the initial amount. And with that kind of demand, sounds like they could, I don't know, do it again? 3rd time's the charm, right? By now, this will all sound very familiar. On June 7, 2021, Michael Saylor tweets that MicroStrategy considers the offering of 400 million of senior secured notes. The offering is oversubscribed. A few days later, the round completes with a volume of 500 million. MicroStrategy goes ahead and buys Bitcoin with it. Another 13,005 Bitcoins for the MicroStrategy Bitcoin Vault. So for now, we can do a total count of all the Bitcoin Michael Saylor owns either privately or through MicroStrategy. However, there's a big but coming, so stick around for the end of the video. In phase 1, they converted their entire cash reserves into Bitcoin, and they acquired a total of 40,000 Bitcoin that way. In phase 2, after raising 3 huge rounds of corporate debt, they bought another 62,103 Bitcoin. And in phase 3, since they started buying regularly with the free cash flows from their business operations, they have added another 2,157 Bitcoin to their balance sheet so far. And finally, remember that according to his own tweet from last October, Michael Saylor himself holds at least 17,732 Bitcoin privately. Alright, time for the drum roll. Altogether that makes 122,816 Bitcoin. You can let that number sink in. However, this video isn't over yet because I promised you that there was a catch. Because Michael Saylor and MicroStrategy don't seem to be done buying Bitcoin just yet. Rather, they seem to be preparing for phase 4 of their Bitcoin accumulation strategy. Phase 4, selling equity for Bitcoin. So on the same day that the last $500 million debt offering completed, MicroStrategy also announced in an SEC filing that they are getting the paperwork done to have the flexibility to sell up to $1 billion of MicroStrategy shares at a moment's notice in the open market. So after turning MicroStrategy into a quasi-Bitcoin fund, they are seemingly now getting ready to sell off parts of the whole company to take the proceeds and buy even more Bitcoin with them. So it looks like this story is far from over, and Michael Saylor will keep looking and finding new ways to buy Bitcoin. By the way, 122,816 Bitcoin out of 21 million Bitcoin that will ever exist. That means that directly or indirectly, Michael Saylor already controls roughly 1 out of 170 Bitcoin that will ever exist. So what do you guys think? Do you think Michael Saylor taking on all this debt is a little reckless? Or do you think that buying Bitcoin with every penny you can find is exactly the right strategy for the years that lie ahead? If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, leave a comment below, share your thoughts, and if you've got any ideas for new videos, I'd love to hear from you. And of course, if you enjoy this kind of content and want to see more, subscribing to the channel would mean the world to me. Until then, I'm Lucas, thank you for watching The Long Game, and I'll see you in the next video.